Okay, so for the final video that I want to record today, and I hope I have enough brain power left, I want to talk about the different exchange rate systems, in particular, mostly floating versus fixed exchange rate, and to explain advantages and disadvantages. And apparently, this is something that you have not covered with Mr. Macario. Okay. Well, I've already talked about exchange rate. Remember that, and that's how you should start. That you can briefly explain that. All right, we live in a global economy. There are many international transactions that involve, of course, residents of different countries where different currencies are used that are trading goods, services, or assets. So we need markets where we can trade one currency for the other. This is what we call the foreign exchange market. And the price of a currency in terms of another in one of these markets is known as the exchange rate. And in fact, there are several ways in which the exchange rate of one currency in terms of another can be determined. Basically, there are three systems. First one is floating exchange rate, which is going to be very simple. Number two is going to be fixed exchange rate. And there is the third one that we call managed exchange rate. For advantages and disadvantages, I will mostly talk about these two. And in fact, I usually like to relate these three exchange rate regimes or systems to the different economic systems, because we'll see that floating means no government intervention, fixed means like maximal intervention, and managed is somewhere in between. So it's similar to a free market economy, a planned economy, and a mixed economy to some extent. Okay, let's start with floating. Very simple. When we talk about a floating exchange rate system, there is no intervention by the government or by the central bank whatsoever, which means that the exchange rate is entirely determined by the supply and the demand for the currency. That's it. So again, you can graph it, and you should graph it. So if you have like the quantity of, let's say, Swiss francs, and here you have the exchange rate. So remember, when you express the exchange rate, you have to choose another currency. So for example, the number of euros per Swiss franc. And you have the supply and the demand. Okay. And that's how the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium exchange rate is being determined without any form of government intervention or intervention by the central bank, which means that whenever the supply of a currency or the demand for a currency will shift, the exchange rate will change, and there is no limit on how high or how low the exchange rate can go. So if you draw another diagram where you have time, and here you have the exchange rate, it can go very, very high and then become very low. It can go anywhere, right? There is no ceiling, there is no floor, it can be absolutely anything. Two keywords that you must mention when the exchange rate goes up, we say that the currency, so when the exchange rate goes up, we say that the currency appreciates. It becomes stronger. On the other hand, and of course, it can be caused by two things. It can be caused when the demand increases. Okay, an increase in demand will lead to an increase in the equilibrium exchange rate, or when supply decreases, it will shift to the left, basically. Just like inflation, right? It could be demand pull or cost. On the other hand, when the exchange rate goes down, we say that the currency depreciates, becomes weaker. This can be caused by a decrease in demand or by an increase in supply. Okay, one or the other. There are several factors that, of course, can lead to a change in supply and demand. Could be the demand for exports. For example, if people abroad, they like my products better, they're going to buy more of my products, and therefore they will demand more of my currency. Could be inflation. For example, if inflation abroad is very high, if inflation in my country is quite low, that makes my products more attractive, more competitive, and therefore people abroad who want to buy more of my currency, the demand will increase. Could be the rate of interest. If the rate of interest is higher in my country than it is in other countries, it's going to attract investment, okay? Because firms, or people abroad, they can save, they can buy assets in my country that pay a high rate of interest. It's attractive, so they are going to buy our assets. So the demand for our currency will increase. Well, there are plenty of factors that can affect the supply and the demand for the currency, but I believe it is a bit beyond the scope of the service. Just remember that for floating exchange rate, it's only the supply and the demand for the currency that determines the equilibrium exchange rate. There is no ceiling, there is no floor. It can go as high or as low as it wants. Basically, any change in supply and demand will make the exchange rate change. No intervention by the central bank or by the government. And please remember these keywords: appreciation, depreciation. Okay. In a fixed exchange rate regime, usually the central bank, or you could say government if you want, government or the central bank, sets what we call a target, exchange rate target, which can be a specific value. For example, let's say €1 or one, of course it's a hypothetical. 1 Swiss franc is equal to I don't know, €1. Why not? Hypothetically. Could be a very specific value like that, or could be a narrow range, a very narrow range. So for example, could be something like 1 Swiss franc is between 0.99 euros and 1.1 euros. This would also be regarded as a fixed exchange rate regime because, okay, it's a range, but it's so tiny that the exchange rate doesn't change much, which means that over time, there are two possibilities. Either the exchange rate is going to become absolutely constant, like that, or, so this is the target, okay, XRT for exchange rates target, or it's just going to, if you have like this very narrow range, it's just going to remain inside this range. For example, in the case of the currency in Saudi Arabia, I'm trying to remember the name, it's SAR, is it the Saudi Riyal? I'm not exactly sure. There is a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar, and it's a value. If you look at the exchange rate, you can Google it if you want. The exchange rate between the currency in Saudi Arabia, the SAR, Saudi Arabia Riyal, if I remember well. If I remember well, it's 6.2 US dollars, and it's fixed, doesn't change at all. But like if you look at the exchange rate between the Hong Kong dollar and the US dollar, it's a very narrow range. So it does change, but within a very, very narrow range. How is it possible? Well, in fact, that's simply, just like in a floating exchange rate system, the exchange rate is determined by supply and demand. Okay? But, and that's the trick, the central bank, mostly the central bank, is going to intervene to shift either supply or demand to maintain the exchange rate. So let me explain how it works. For example, imagine that we have a target of one, we are the Swiss National Bank, and we have a target of 1 franc is equal to €1. And right now, 1 franc is equal to 0.98 euros. So, well, it means that the franc is too weak. It means the exchange rate is too low. We are below target. So we want to increase the exchange rate. So we are aligned with the target. Well, the most common way to do so is to have the central bank use its foreign exchange reserves. Central banks, they keep reserves of foreign currency For example, the Swiss National Bank will hold reserves in euros, in US dollars, in British pounds, and other major currencies to influence the supply and the demand for our currency. So for example, here, the franc is too weak, so we want it to appreciate. Well, we can simply buy Swiss franc. So the Swiss National Bank can demand more Swiss francs with the foreign exchange reserve. So to make it more clear, the Central Bank of Switzerland can go to the foreign exchange market and use reserves of US dollars, for example, say, hey, I want to give US dollars, and in return, I want Swiss francs. That's a possibility. So basically, the Swiss National Bank is going to buy Swiss francs with US dollars. This means that because the Swiss National Bank is buying francs, the demand for Swiss francs will increase. And guess what? What happens to the exchange rate when the demand increases? It goes up. So by intervening in the Forex, by purchasing its own currency with any other foreign currency, the central bank can ensure that the exchange rate will increase. What if we are above the target? Now the exchange rate is too high. We are above our target. Same thing. One possibility is to have the central bank trade foreign currencies, but in that case, the exchange rate is too high. We want the Swiss franc to depreciate. One way to depreciate the Swiss franc is to increase the supply, right? If supply increases, shift to the right, well, then the exchange rate will go down. So what the central bank can do is simply to sell Swiss francs and to obtain another currency. In other words, the Swiss National Bank can purchase foreign currencies, let's say US dollars, with Swiss francs. So the Swiss National Bank goes to the foreign exchange market and gives Swiss francs, supplies more Swiss francs, and purchases US dollars. So the supply of the Swiss franc will increase and the exchange rate will go down. That's the primary method to set or to keep the exchange rate on target by trading foreign exchange reserves in the Forex. It's not the only solution. The central bank can also use the rate of interest, but then it becomes a bit complex, and I don't want to enter into the details. I believe it's sufficient if you just remember that you understand that and that you are able to explain, to do the same type of illustrations, to say, okay, what if it's too high? What if it's too low? What do we do? Is it going to affect supply, demand, blah, blah, blah. Something that you should know is that, of course, in a fixed exchange rate regime, the central bank sets a target, but this target can be changed from time to time, okay? For example, if I draw here time, and here I'm going to do the exchange rate, we may have a target, let's say at, 1. And it's possible that at this point in time, let's say 2023, why not, we decide to change the target. It's possible, right? The central bank or the government, they meet and they say, well, okay, maybe our target is too high, maybe it's too low, so we can revise the target. Perhaps we can increase the target. Okay, so now it's going to be, I don't know, 1.2. This is called a revaluation. It's not the same as an appreciation. An appreciation is just when the exchange rate goes up. A revaluation is when the exchange rate target is increased, when we aim at a higher exchange rate in a fixed exchange rate system. On the other hand, if in 2023 we decide to decrease the target, let's say from 1 to, I don't know, 0.7, why not? Same thing, we lower the exchange rate target, we call this a devaluation. So again, that's not the same thing. Devaluation is not the same as depreciation. Depreciation is when the exchange rate goes down. A devaluation is when the exchange rate target decreases. Okay, that's pretty much everything you need to know about a fixed exchange rate system. Before we talk about pros and cons, and it's going to be rather quick, a quick word about the managed exchange rate system, which is in between. And as you can imagine, same thing, let's just put, let's just do that time, and that's the exchange rate. What happens is that the central bank or the government, they set a range. So there is like a minimum value for the exchange rate, and there is a maximum value for the exchange rate. And as long as the exchange rate remains in between, we don't do anything. We let it float. Okay. So we would it's in that case there would not be any intervention by the central bank or by the government. The exchange rate would be able to freely float. But as soon as the exchange rate becomes too low, then this triggers the intervention by the central bank or by the government, mostly the central bank. And so in that case, if it's too low, well, the central bank can can purchase its own currency with another currency, for example, use the foreign exchange reserves to increase the demand for the currency and make sure that the exchange rate appreciates. And on the other hand, if the currency becomes too high, we are outside of the acceptable scope, then the central bank can purchase foreign currencies with Swiss francs. So this would increase the supply of Swiss francs and the exchange rate would go down. Okay. So essentially, anytime the exchange rate becomes too high or too low, this triggers an intervention to just keep it within this range that is regarded as acceptable. And of course, the wider the range, the closer we are to a free float exchange system, and the more narrow the range, the closer we are to a fixed exchange rate system. And again, just like in the case of a fixed exchange rate, this band, this range can change over time. So okay, maybe this was the range before, and maybe we revised it. Okay, maybe we now have, I don't know, something like that. Okay, so so the exchange rate will basically behave like that. Something. Okay, so it's in between. We call that managed or managed float. We also sometimes call that dirty float, but we don't care. So what's good and what's bad about I'm not going to talk about managed, but mostly floating and fixed. There is not much to say about it. I'm just going to focus on the key elements. What's good about floating is that it's simple. It does not require any form of intervention. What is bad is that it is very uncertain. Certain because we don't know what the exchange is going to be. And that can be a problem, because imagine you are a business and you consider starting a business, or you consider expanding to export some of your products, but clearly the exchange rate is such an important element when it comes to assessing whether your project is, well, profitable or not. And changes in the interest rate, they create uncertainty, and this can discourage investment. So that's the bad news. And uncertainty can discourage the investment, so it's bad. Something that is good in a floating exchange rate is that it tends to protect countries when there is a recession in another country. Protects, so there is like a protection. Let me explain. Imagine we are in Switzerland and there are a big recession in China. Why not? So when there is a big recession, income falls. So now people in China, well, they can't really afford to come to Switzerland for the holiday. They can't afford to buy very expensive watches, stuff like that. So from our perspective, it means that the demand for our currency will decrease very much, right? Because then, like people in China, they don't want to buy Swiss goods, services, and assets. So there is a decrease in the currency, in the demand for the currency. In a floating exchange rate system, in fact, let's start with a fixed. It's going to make more sense. Imagine that we had a fixed exchange rate system. So the demand for the currency decreases very much, but the central bank intervenes, so the exchange rate doesn't change at all. Okay. But now, people abroad, people in China, the exchange rate remains the same, they have less money, so they just buy less Swiss products. That's bad for us because we export less towards China. So exports decrease, and so aggregate demand decrease, and we will be hit by this crisis. Okay, the crisis in China will spread out and it will affect us because people in China, they don't want to buy Swiss products anymore. So, but if we have a floating exchange rate, pay attention. As the demand for our currency decreases, because people in China, they don't want to buy our products anymore because they have less income. Our currency will depreciate. It will become weaker, which means that now for people in China, now the Swiss franc is weaker, it's cheaper to buy Swiss products. So yes, they have less income, but it's cheaper to buy Swiss products. So in fact, our exports towards China may not decrease very significantly. So even though there is a crisis in China, this might not affect us very much because our exports will remain pretty steady. Okay? And that is clearly a problem. Of course, it's pretty much the opposite. That's a problem that we have in a fixed exchange rate regime. Well, first, it's complicated. It requires constant intervention by the government and by the central bank. And in particular, when you think about it, there is a risk that that the central bank will run out of reserves. Imagine if we keep selling foreign currencies, or at some stage, we might just end up not having foreign exchange reserves anymore. And in that case, that's a big problem, because if we can't keep purchasing our own currency with foreign currencies, because we've just tried to artificially maintain a higher exchange rate than the equilibrium exchange rate, if we run out, we will not be able to maintain the exchange rate where it is expected to. So it's complicated, it requires intervention, there is the risk that we may run out of reserve. The main advantage, oops, well, different color, why not, is that it is certain. It provides certainty. In a fixed exchange rate system, especially businesses, they know what the exchange rate is going to be in 1 year or 2 years. Unless the country either revalues or devalues the currency too frequently, but usually it doesn't happen very often. So it provides certainty about what the exchange rate is going to be, and this is something that makes it easier for firms to assess how profitable future investment projects are, and this is something that can stimulate or facilitate investment. Because there you don't face the exchange rate risk that you are facing in a floating exchange rate system. And the counterpart, here you are more, let's just put it today, crisis can spread more easily. So of course, these are the same, the two sides of the same coin, okay? So crisis can spread more easily, because as I explained, if there is a crisis in China, they have less income, so they want to buy less of our product. But if there is a fixed exchange rate, even though the demand for our currency decreases, the exchange rate remains the same. So it's as costly as before for them to buy Swiss products, and they have less income, so they will definitely buy this. And so, well, of course, this is gonna harm our economy, fall in Haiti, and all the consequences that you know. Okay, I think these are probably the main advantages and disadvantages of each system. And I think we have definitely enough to talk for 7 minutes. Remember, you start by explaining why we need foreign exchange markets in a global economy. You define exchange rate, of course. Then you explain that there are 3 key exchange rate systems, free float, fixed, and managed. You explain free float, and in particular, don't forget to explain who demands and who supplies the currency. Do not forget to mention the term appreciation and depreciation. Explain what can cause the appreciation, what can cause the depreciation. Then you move on to fixed exchange rate regime. You can graph, like the show that over time this is the exchange rate remain the same. You can give the example, the Saudi Arabian Riyal versus US dollar, the Hong Kong dollar versus the US dollar. and most importantly, explained how the central bank does that, how the central bank maintains this exchange rate by trading foreign exchange reserves. Talk about devaluation and revaluation when we either increase or decrease the target. And finally, talk about this managed float exchange rate system where we set this range of acceptable exchange rates, and we only intervene if we go too high or if we go too low. Finally, for advantages and disadvantages, okay, one is simple, the other is complicated because it requires constant intervention. One is uncertain, the other is certain. It's a big advantage of a fixed exchange rate regime. Spend time explaining this idea. So make sure you understand it and ask me if you still don't understand that. The idea that fixed exchange rate regimes, they facilitate the spread of economic crisis, whereas floating exchange rate systems, they tend to isolate crises and make sure they don't contaminate the entire world economy. Right, that's it.